Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin.
I'd like to welcome you to a special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. I'm Bart Ehrman, and today I will not be interviewed by Megan Lewis. I will be doing the interview. This is the second podcast devoted to a discussion of early Christian Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament that are known as infancy Gospels. These are accounts that deal with Jesus prior to his public ministry, one of which, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, is about Jesus as a boy from the ages of 5 to 12 and the kind of mischievous deeds he was up to as one who had the power of the Son of God, but was not behaving the way you would probably want your own children to behave. We talked about that last time, and this time we're going to be talking about the Proto-Gospel of James, which is more about what was happening before the Gospels with the birth of Mary and why she was chosen to be the bearer of the Son of God. My guest, again, is Christopher Frilingos, who is an expert on both of these Gospels. He has written a book called Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, which is about these Gospels and trying to show how we can understand them. A very interesting book that is compelling and rooted in very serious scholarship, but is accessible. And so it's a book you should look into. Chris is a professor at Michigan State University. He teaches there biblical studies, biblical literature, and the history of early Christianity. He did his undergraduate degree here in North Carolina at Greensboro College. And after college, he went to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland to do a master's degree. And then he ended up here in Chapel Hill to do a PhD in religious studies. Chris was my student as he went through his program many years ago now. And he's been teaching at Michigan State for a long time. His earlier book was also a really interesting book on the book of Revelation. It's called Spectacles of Empire: Monsters, Martyrs, and the Book of Revelation. And it also was published by University of Pennsylvania Press. Today, we will be talking about the second of these infancy Gospels that we mentioned earlier, the Proto-Gospel of James. So, Chris, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Bart. Thanks for having me. It means a lot to hear you describe this Jesus, Mary, and Joseph book as accessible, because you've really set the standard for that with your own writing. So I appreciate the praise. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And it's not easy to write a book for, we're trained, as you know, you were trained to write books for scholars, and it's hard to kind of make the switch. But I think your book is accessible, and it is, it's not written at a low level. It's written at a high level, but it's completely understandable and comprehensible, and it makes really some really interesting points. I should point out anecdotally, Chris, I think you know this. One of my long-term interests for many years now has been the apocryphal New Testament, the apocryphal writings, the early Christian writings that aren't in the New Testament. And when you were a student here, I wasn't that interested in it. So for those of you, no one else would know this, but I got interested in this field because of Chris Frilingos. And so I was teaching PhD students, and I had a range of PhD courses I would do. And Chris, one semester, I forget which you must have been in your second or third year, I don't know, but you said you wanted to do a independent study on the early Christian Apocrypha. And I thought, oh God, I mean, I knew something about it. I kind of rolled my eyes and, it's not really my expertise. And so I told you, I don't know if you remember this. I said, okay, look, you write a syllabus and explain what you're going to do, and I'll let you do it. and then you told somebody else that you were doing it. So somebody else added the class, and then it ended up being a course. And that got me interested. And then I started reading all of this stuff. I mean, I knew most of the primary materials, but I wasn't an expert in anything. And it got me going. And now I consider it one of the major things I'm interested in as a result.
Yeah, no, I remember that. It's even worse than that, Bart. I think you were on research sabbatical.
Really?
We like strong-armed you into doing the course.
God, I'd forgotten that.
So now that I'm a faculty member, I understand what kind of sacrifice that was. But at the time, you were willing to do it, and that was a great course. That's where I really started taking these infancy gospels seriously.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that. I think earlier in my career, I was a real pushover when it came to things like that, but I was a real hard ass when it came to grading and such. I still have people complain to me about how I was grading their graduate work. And now I'm just a pushover all over the map, except I am not teaching anything on my research leave next semester. I can just tell you, it ain't going to happen. So, all right. So Chris, we had the earlier episode on the infancy gospel of Thomas, and you talked about it, how it's kind of filling the gaps between what you don't have in the New Testament, where you have one story about Jesus as a 12-year-old, but otherwise you don't have accounts of Jesus between the time of his birth and the time of his baptism, except for this one story in Luke chapter 2. And in some ways, these other gospels are kind of filling in the gaps. But you wanted to argue that it's not just that. This is not just books trying to give you the information you're missing out on, that it's actually dealing with very important issues. And your way of reading this is that these are, you're calling them family gospels. They're dealing with issues involved with families, with a particularly unusual case of what do you do in a family where the child is the son of God? Mm-hmm. But you still have problems, and the problems are exacerbated by the fact that he's the son of God. But there are problems with what to do about conflict in families, and this infancy gospel of Thomas in some ways is kind of wrestling with those problems. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
So now we're moving to a different gospel that is called the Proto-Gospel of James. And could you explain what that title means? Proto-Gospel? This isn't a kind of term one would normally use.
No, right. So that title comes from a Latin title that was given to it in the early modern period. I prefer now to think of it as the birth of Mary, which is in the incipit of the manuscripts that we have, and I think it reduces confusion between this and the infancy gospel of Thomas. But what the title Proto-Gospel of James was going for is that this is a kind of prequel to the storytelling we find in the canonical Gospels. So what was the life of Mary like before she became pregnant with Jesus? Who were her parents? What was her family life like? Those kinds of questions seem to be driving the storytelling in it.
I mean, of course, in Roman Catholic circles, Mary features prominently, and so in those circles, there are traditions about Mary that are widespread. I was raised in a Protestant tradition, and Mary was important because she was chosen by God to bear His Son. But we didn't really reflect a lot on Mary, and we certainly didn't have traditions about Mary that were anything we would think of. But in the Catholic tradition, it wasn't really quite that way. And can you just say something just briefly about like these Catholic traditions about Mary? I mean, she's, eventually, I guess not her afterlife, which is a big thing in Roman Catholic, but also kind of before Jesus, there are these stories about her. Do these go back to this proto-gospel, or they start somewhere else, or how does that work?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And at least some of the ideas about Mary do go back to the proto-gospel. So Right. It's hard to overstate, I think, the difference in understanding between Protestants and Catholics on the subject of Mary. So Mary is part of the formal teaching of the Catholic Church in a way that she's not found in Protestant teaching. One dimension of teaching around Mary in the Catholic tradition is that she was perpetually virgin. So the notion of perpetual virginity is something that has its source in the Proto-Gospel of James, in this story of the birth of Mary.
So this is the tradition that it's not just that she conceived as a she was a virgin when she conceived, but also
that's right.
She remained a virgin her entire life.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So the notion that any of the family members associated with Jesus in the Gospels, sometimes translated as siblings, in some Catholic translations, you'll see terms like cousins, that Mary is not responsible for any of those relations of Jesus, that the only child she gave birth to was Jesus, and that she never had sexual relations.
So the brothers of Jesus in the New Testament, James, the brother of Jesus, there are four named in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6. Those aren't really brothers then in this understanding. They're some other kind of relation because Mary never had sex. Okay.
That's right. And the Proto-Gospel of James addresses this in some, I say address it as if like this teaching about perpetual virginity was already there and it needed to be explained. I'm not sure that's what happened. But the storytelling around the Proto-Gospel of James is that Joseph is a very, very old man, and he's already got sons from a previous marriage. He's a widower. And so references to the brothers of Jesus are stepbrothers or to sisters or whomever. Yeah. This is something I think that Jerome actually found problematic because he wanted to see Joseph as a virgin too.
He's a saint. Saint couldn't have sex.
Exactly right. And so it's Jerome that insists that we're talking about cousins here. So he had some problems with the Proto-Gospel of James.
Yeah. And okay, so let's talk about the gospel itself and just explain where it starts, because the New Testament Gospels start with Matthew and Luke start with the birth of Jesus, and Mary is old enough to be pregnant, and Joseph we're not told how old Joseph is in the New Testament Gospels, but I think even in Protestant circles, it's often thought that Joseph was an older man and Mary was young. And so, but the Proto-Gospel starts way before that. So could you just say kind of how it starts out and what happens within it?
Right. And let me just say one thing about that. I think you're right about that Protestants think of Joseph as an old man. And I think this may be the whole reason why, is that Joseph disappears from the canonical Gospels after these stories about Jesus's birth in Matthew and Luke. So we don't see him again. And so the explanation is, well, he must have been old and died. It's the Proto-Gospel of James that actually depicts him as an old man. And
that influenced art through the centuries, right? Because when you see like nativity scenes, almost always Joseph is portrayed as old. And when you get into the early movies about Jesus, Joseph is always old. It's just like everybody thinks, oh, he's old. But you're right. It doesn't say that in the new. But okay, so in the new, you get the brother and the brothers and sisters and mother, but when Jesus is an adult, but not Joseph. And so,
not Joseph. Okay.
All right. So the Proto-Gospel, right. So where does that start?
So it begins with the story of Mary's parents. This is a retelling in some ways of biblical stories from the Jewish scriptures that people are familiar with, like the story of Hannah becoming pregnant with Samuel. So Mary's parents, before she's born, their names are Joachim and Anna. And Anna cannot get pregnant. And so in biblical parlance, she's described as barren. This is a source of great upset for the two of them. And through miraculous intervention, through an angelic announcement, Anna learns that she's going to be pregnant, and she conceives and gives birth to Mary. And from the beginning, Mary seems different. So one of the early stories after the birth of Mary is that as a 6-month-year-old, Anna calls to her, and she's on the floor like you'd expect a 6-month-year-old to be, just not moving. But then she stands up and takes 7 steps. And Anna says, okay, well, her feet are never going to touch the floor from now on, and I'm going to turn her bedroom into a sanctuary. So we start to see the story unfold. Mary grows up. She's got some holy qualities about her. She actually ends up in the temple at the age of 3, dances on the altar, just totally charms everybody, moves into the temple, and in the temple, she is given the task of spinning thread for the curtain of the temple, which is an interesting detail. Then at the age of 12, the priests in the temple become concerned that she's going to begin menstruating, and this would create purity issues. So they need to find a way to take care of Mary, but outside the temple. So as it turns out, the high priest in the temple is Zechariah, who readers will know is the father of John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke. And Zechariah calls for the eligible men of Israel to come to the temple, and they're going to have a kind of drawing of lots ceremony, and Joseph is there. And Joseph draws lots, and he is the lucky winner to take care of Mary, but he objects at first and says, I'm old, I've already got sons. What am I going to do? And the priest says to him, look, you're just taking care of her. You're not going to have sex with her. You're just going to take care of her. And I don't want there to be any hint of impropriety about this. So the story continues, and you can see that all of these details are being thrown in about Mary, and there's a real big concern here about her purity and purity remaining intact, both ritual purity, but also virginity. And in the middle of the gospel, there are some moments of doubt. Joseph goes off to work. He's in construction, and he comes back and finds Mary pregnant. So he wants to know what's happened. And Mary says, an angel told me I was going to be pregnant, and I am, and I don't know anything else besides that. And Joseph is angry about it and accuses her of impropriety. She defends herself. Joseph, in the end, has a kind of long night of the soul. An angel tells him not to worry, that Mary is telling the truth. And then the couple is tested by other authorities in the area who've learned what's happened, and they decide that the couple must undergo an ordeal. So a kind of virginity test. The couple survives. They get cast out into the wilderness. They survive this test, and it demonstrates the truthfulness of Mary's report.
Okay, can you stop at that point? I've got some questions about this. So Anna miraculously gives birth, but she's not a virgin. Is that right? No, she is not. It's clear that the couple has been trying to have children up to this point, but they have not. So the miracle is more like in the Old Testament, where God,
exactly,
a woman who can't get pregnant, God makes sure. So it's a miraculous birth, and then the thing about purity with Mary. So she's in the temple, and she's there till she's 12, and but then so the idea is that menstrual blood is it's not a sin or something, but in the Jewish tradition, it creates a uncleanness, impurity that has to be, and you can't allow that to be in the temple. So then they set up can you explain this virginity test? What is it like? Multiple choice? Is it what?
Yeah, no, it's not. I'm sorry, I kind of glossed over that. Yeah, so so the story doesn't seem to have many parallels in the Jewish scriptures, but it's got a number of parallels in Greco-Roman novels that were being written around the same time, where a young couple is kind of put to different different tests and have to overcome these tests and maintain their virginity and then get married at the end. And there is something to be said that this same idea is happening here, that this couple, who readers know have not had sex, is nevertheless under suspicion because Mary is pregnant. And so they must also undergo an ordeal where they have to survive some kind of test in the wilderness. And when they survive, then it shows that they were telling the truth. If not, of course, then.
Yeah, then it'd be bad news, right? Okay.
All
right. So they get off the hook, and turns out they've not had sex. She is pregnant. And then, okay, so what happens?
So then the story starts to overlap with details readers will be more familiar with from the Christian New Testament. So the Proto-Gospel contains elements that we find in both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So there's a census commanded by Augustus, and this means that Joseph and Mary are going to have to travel to Bethlehem. And so they do. And on the way, Joseph finds a cave for Mary to give birth in. And so the birth of Jesus takes place in this cave. Now, there are a couple of stories connected to the birth of Jesus that are pretty significant in the Proto-Gospel of James and not paralleled in the canonical gospel. So one of them is this really interesting moment that seems to happen at the same time that Jesus is born off in the cave. Joseph is scouring the countryside looking for a midwife, and all of a sudden time stands still. And he sees just everything kind of frozen in place. And many scholars reading this story think that that this is a parallel to other stories of important religious figures we have in other traditions, like stories about the birth of the Buddha, where time kind of stands still, and as if to announce that something of cosmic significance is happening. So meanwhile, Jesus is being born in the cave. And in the cave itself, a midwife attends to Mary and then tells a colleague named Salome that she's seen something miraculous happen, that a virgin has given birth. Salome doesn't believe this and decides that she is going to find out if this is true. And this, to my mind, is one of the most astonishing episodes in all of early Christian literature. Salome performs a virginity test using her finger. And when she reaches out to inspect Mary, her hand goes up in flames. So it is this really startling image in the cave. Jesus has been born, and Salome's hand is on fire. Salome repents of what she's done, repents of her disbelief, and the infant Jesus heals Salome on the spot. So this is a terrifying, miraculous scene that's right in the kind of the heart of this proto-gospel. After this story, there are some other stories that wrap the gospel up, including the murder of Zechariah. Later on in the story, this is where an element from Matthew is brought into the storytelling. Herod learns about Magi coming to look for the newborn king and orders the massacre of babies. And in doing so, Herod's agents confront Zechariah. Zechariah tries to protect his newborn child, John, and his wife, and the agents kill him in the temple. And this is how the Proto-Gospel of James concludes. It's a rather startling conclusion.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot to talk about here.
There is.
For one thing, maybe it'd be helpful for us to clarify to listeners. between a number of terms that they've probably heard. When we talk about the birth of Jesus in the New Testament, we call it the virgin birth, but technically it's not a virgin birth, right? I mean, it's a virginal conception. And it seems like and we can explain, so the virginal conception, that's easily enough explained. I mean, Mary conceives while she's still a virgin. She's never had sex, and yet she gets pregnant. So that's a conception that's virginal. Is that the same as a virginal birth?
Right. That's a good question. I don't think so. I think that the Proto-Gospel of James is suggesting more the second idea of virgin birth, that Jesus appears miraculously, but has not come through Mary's birth canal. So Mary remains a kind of sealed vessel. This is uncomfortable to talk about. But that's, I think, is what is going on in this storytelling, that there is an emphasis on kind of bodily integrity, bodily wholeness. And this is foreshadowed in the concern about Mary beginning to menstruate in the temple, and then followed through on in this story about the birth of Jesus in the cave and Salome's.
I mean, I assume it's related to the concept that if a woman's hymen had been broken, that she wasn't considered a virgin. And I'm talking about in a variety of ancient cultures. And so, for a woman to be a virgin meant not to have her hymen broken. And in this case, the hymen wouldn't be broken even by the birth. That's and so right. It's not, so in some ways it's inaccurate to call what happens in the New Testament a virginal birth. I mean, the New Testament doesn't talk about that. It talks about a virginal conception, but the proto-gospel is moving toward it sounds like Salome wants to find out, and she's trying to find out, and so it's a virginal, and it's a virginal birth. The other concept that students don't quite get straight is the immaculate conception, which is people tend to think that means the virginal conception, virgin birth. Is that what the immaculate conception is?
So no, I don't think so. And the Proto-Gospel of James doesn't really address the notion of the Immaculate Conception, but this has to do with the conception of Mary, that there's an interruption in the transmission of sin, and that she is conceived miraculously, immaculately, and so Jesus then is born without sin. So again, another way of measuring the difference between the way we'd say maybe Protestants think about Mary and the way that formal teaching in the Catholic Church understands Mary.
So just chronologically speaking, like if you set this up as a sequence of events, the Immaculate Conception would be about the birth of Mary. And in the Proto-Gospel, I mean, she's born miraculously, but it's because God allows her mother to get pregnant. But the Immaculate Conception, so it's kind of complicated, right? But it goes back to where like someone like St. Augustine argues that Jesus didn't have a sin nature like the rest of us. And if you understand that the sin nature is passed on by the sex act, which Augustine believed, that when a man has sex with a woman, there's a physical transmission of the sin nature that we all have from Adam through the semen, and it goes into the woman, and so the child born has that sin nature. But if Jesus was born if Mary had a sin nature, she would have passed it on to Jesus. That was the idea. So Mary had to be born without a sin nature. And so the Immaculate Conception is that when Anna conceived, God made a miracle that she didn't pass on her sin nature. Is that right? That's right.
Yeah. I mean, the physicality of it is the thing that's I find myself trying to convey to students, that original sin isn't this like abstract notion, which I think is the way that many Protestants kind of understand it. That we're talking about physical transmission in the same way we might be talking about DNA.
That's right.
Like that's the way Augustine is conceiving of it, at least.
So when somebody says virginal conception, they mean that the sin nature was not passed along through the kind of the DNA, to Mary. So Mary didn't have a sin nature that she could pass on to Jesus. So that explains why Jesus didn't have a sin nature, even though he was born of a woman. But so you get the virginal conceptions about Mary. The virginal conception is about Mary conceiving. The virginal birth is about Mary remaining virgin afterwards. Right. And of those three, the New Testament just does the virginal conception. Is that the fair way to get it straight?
I think that's fair. That's right.
Yeah. My Protestant students also just are completely mystified by all of this. But it's, when I taught at Rutgers before I came to UNC, most of my students were Roman Catholic. And at UNC, when students write complaints about me in their course evaluations, as you know, they complain because I think the Bible has mistakes in it or contradictions. And at Rutgers, that was never the issue with these Roman Catholic students. They couldn't believe that I thought Jesus had brothers. Because they didn't know the Bible, but they knew Jesus didn't have brothers. Come on. So they knew about the virginal, perpetual virginity. What that was about.
So. Institutional context makes a big difference.
Exactly right. Yes. So you get this. It's a very interesting set of stories, and again, you in some ways, it's, of course, in this one, it's kind of more of a no-brainer not to call this an infancy gospel, because there's not much of the. It's not really about Jesus, as you're saying. And the older title is The Birth of Mary. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's the way that scholars tend to think of it, that's the earliest attribution that we have. And that's part of the manuscript tradition as well.
Yeah, right. So for one thing, can you say something about why it's connected with James?
Yes, right. Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, the contents of the Proto-Gospel, it's kind of a 3-act thing. And so you could really understand it in that way. And you have the first part that's really about kind of Joachim and Anna, and then the middle part's about Mary and Joseph, and then the last, this strange martyrdom story about Zechariah. And then at the very end is this epilogue where the narrator adds his name, James, as the one who has witnessed all of these things. And I think that James makes an appearance earlier in the account when in the description of the story of Joseph and Mary traveling to Jerusalem, and Mary's on a donkey. One of the text says that one of Joseph's sons pulls the donkey. I think we're supposed to believe that this is James, but yes, this must be according to the epilogue. At least this is James, the brother of Jesus, who's witnessed them all.
Yeah, well, so he would know these things. Right. I mean, so he's the brother, and so okay, good. So you don't, as we said in our earlier episode, you don't prefer calling these infancy gospels. You think of them as family gospels. And with the infancy gospel of Thomas, this is showing like conflict in the family when you've got the Son of God who's doing these things and you don't know how to deal with this as a family. So what about the Proto-Gospel of James? In what sense is that a family gospel for you?
Right. And so in the same way, we're talking about kind of conflict and persisting through it, although I think the focus is less on Jesus because he doesn't really have anything to do in this particular gospel except heal Salome's hand, and more on the relationship between Mary and Joseph. So this is one of the reasons why I treat these gospels together, because they kind of complement one another. If one is looking at parenting, the other one is looking at a kind of quasi-spousal relationship. Although, I say quasi just to kind of to qualify what's going on here, because they are married, but they're not. Joseph has a really difficult time describing their relationship when questioned by the midwife. But in the same way that the infancy gospel shows controversies and conflicts, and then members of a family having to kind of pull together through it, the Proto-Gospel of James does. So we've talked about one of them, and that is the unplanned for pregnancy of Mary, which Joseph is not around for. So here we see the storyteller kind of thinking in a nuanced way about what would be plausible. Well, if Joseph is there and Mary is told she's going to conceive, then why would he be puzzled by then seeing her pregnant. But in the Proto-Gospel of James, he's off working and he comes home. And so we might think naturally he suspects that Mary has been having sex with somebody, and he is disappointed by it. When he questions Mary, and Mary says, look, I don't know how this happened, we're getting into a situation where the tension is just being ratcheted up. I mean, we're starting to be invited to see things through Joseph's eyes here. He's not being given the kind of information that would allay his concerns. Instead, he's being given information that might make him even more concerned. So this is one of these moments where you could imagine a kind of breaking apart, and yet they stay together. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, how could she say she doesn't know how? In the story, doesn't the angel tell her how before?
Yeah, I think that this is just under kind of the withering questioning of Joseph. We're supposed to remember that Mary is young in this story. So she leaves the temple before she turns 12, and Joseph is this old man with great authority, and he comes home and starts accusing her, and she's thrown by it. So I think it's more his outburst than anything that Mary is kind of cowering from and doesn't really know how to answer him.
So he's been, I mean, when you say he's gone, he's not like off at work every day. You mean he's gone.
He's gone for months, according to the storyteller.
And comes back, and here she is pregnant. He says, how are you pregnant? She says, I have no idea.
Right. Yeah. In the meantime, Mary has gone to visit her cousin, Elizabeth, to let her know what's happened. And Elizabeth is overjoyed, but Joseph, when he returns, is not. So,
I mean, in terms of family tensions, I mean, you got all sorts of things going on here. The husband who's away the whole time, the woman who's by herself, the woman who's accused of sexual dalliance and but wants to proclaim her innocence. And I mean, so in your book, I mean, you talk about how, if you put yourself in the position of these people, like if you put yourself in Joseph's position, you just think about what that's like. It's clearly, it isn't just a kind of a flimsy account of, things that happened before Jesus was born. It's actually getting really deeply into interpersonal relationships and the complications. And they're not, obviously the supernatural part of it isn't something we experience, but many people have had, these kinds of difficulties, right?
Right. And the seeds for this are sown in the Gospel of Matthew. So Joseph is depicted as needing some reassurance, like he wants to do right by Mary, but he doesn't want to stay with her in the Gospel of Matthew. So he's reassured, and the marriage there remains intact. In the Proto-Gospel of James, we're giving a little bit more insight into his thought process. So because Mary's pregnancy becomes public in the Proto-Gospel of James in a way we don't really see in Matthew and Luke, Joseph has a whole different set of concerns that he's got to wrestle with. So even if he's reassured privately that Mary is telling the truth, he knows that interrogators are going to have some questions for him, and he's going to have to answer them. And he chooses in that moment to take Mary's side, to stand with her and to say she's telling the truth. She hasn't done anything wrong. Without overstating it, I think what we're seeing are a series of moments where Joseph is given the opportunity to decide in a different way, to make a different choice. And that is also, I think, building tension in the storytelling, rather than resolving it.
Because in Matthew, it's solved fairly quickly. He has a dream and he's informed. And here, he stands beside her, even though he hasn't had this divine revelation. And I guess the only time he really is convinced is when they go through this ordeal, and he realizes she comes through as cleanly as he does, and he knows he didn't do anything. And so that's but he stands beside her before that. Is that?
That's right. That's right. Then undergoes the ordeal with Mary. So the idea of a man undergoing this same ordeal as Mary as a woman is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And this ordeal is really based on whether or not Mary is telling the truth. This can't be a virginity ordeal for Joseph. He's already got sons. So
right.
it's a truth-telling exercise rather than about bodily integrity here. So Joseph is implicated in it.
I mean, trusting a partner that you're suspicious of is, So this is not, this isn't one of these kind of stories that's just kind of interest. It's actually something that can reach down and touch people. I mean, it's I think so. Yeah. It's the relationship between the two of them is the thing that, I wanted to write most about in my book. And so there are parts of the Proto-Gospel of James that get more attention from other scholars, but I think that this is the beating heart of this story, that this is why people found it compelling. What is it that Joseph knows and understands about Mary, and what does he not know? And how does he come to terms with the things that he's never going to really understand about her or the child that she gives birth to? It's interesting from looking at it as a narrative, because at the beginning, Joachim and Anna, the problem is they can't get pregnant, and that creates a huge rift in their relationship. And then the problem at the end is that Mary does get pregnant without, and that creates the huge rift. And both of these are problems that people experience. And so, wow, okay. Are there other things about this proto-gospel that you'd like to talk about before we end up?
Yeah, so we didn't discuss the martyrdom of Zechariah, which is this really gruesome story at the end. I mean, it goes into a lot of detail about the violence done to Zechariah. But I would say again, if you read the story, this is another example of family members kind of sacrificing something of themselves in order to protect others. So the storyteller...
Give the story, give the summary of it, because he's like a high priest or something here, right?
Right, yeah. In this version, so Zechariah is in the temple, and he has sent Elizabeth and his baby son, John, away for safekeeping, because Herod has sent his agents out to kill the babies. And when confronted by the agents, Zechariah says, I don't know where they are, which may be the truth. It may not be. It's hard to know for sure. But he ends up dying in order to protect them. Joseph does not have to die in order to protect Mary, but he also sacrifices his own safety, his own well-being, in order to protect Mary, to stand with her and her version of what's happened in the face of scrutiny. So we have these three different family stories: Joachim and Anna, Joseph and Mary, Zechariah and Elizabeth. And all of these stories in some way are built on conflict and addressing the conflict, if not entirely overcoming it. And so I think that gives it a really humane quality, the storytelling in this gospel.
That's very interesting, because somebody just this last week wrote me and said that they just read this, somebody on my blog, and they said that they think this ending is just kind of tacked on, because the Zechariah thing doesn't seem to have to do with anything. And scholars since the early 20th century have said there are three sources here, three sources that the authors kind of stitched together, and it doesn't really work very well. But the way you're painting it, in fact, these are three episodes about marital relationships that are really fundamentally dealing with very similar issues, and standing up for someone, a family member, a spouse, even at a serious cost.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I think there is a narrative coherence to it. So.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks, Chris. This has been really good. And again, the book that Chris has written is called Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And you can buy this book at a discount. Is it Penn Press? Is that Penn?
That's right. Yeah. Thanks, Bart. Yeah. So it's pennpress.org. Okay. And if you go to that page and order the book, you can use a promotion code, which is my last name, Frilingos, with the number 30 attached to it. And this will give you a discount on ordering the book. So you can't apply it on like Amazon or other online booksellers. You have to go to the publisher's website for it.
Okay. That's great. And if people are, if you're interested in reading any of these books, I've mentioned before on here that I've got my colleague Zlatko Pleša and I did a book called The Other Gospels that has translations of both of these books and lots of other books, apocryphal books. And so it's a very interesting it's a very interesting field of study. These books that didn't make it into the New Testament, people, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years have gotten really interested in this topic. And so I think, and it's worth being interested in because it may not tell us about the historical Jesus or the historical Mary or, what really happened, but it tells us a lot about how people were thinking about their faith and about Christ and about Jesus and Mary and like how Christianity is developing in very interesting ways and wrestling with problems that people wrestle with today, obviously. So, well, thanks, Chris.
I totally agree. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Chris. So
thank you, Bart. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Yeah, this is fun. So thank you all for coming to this special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. And we'll be back soon, only it'll be Megan and me again. So I hope to see you then.
This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.